This is the morning brief from the Economic Times.
From sunny beaches with aquamarine waters to Central American republics known till recently more for being a strategic transit route for global trade. From the European playground of the global look set known for its casinos and Grand Prix and car chases in James Bond films to an island off Florida that currently holds banking assets equal to 1/15 of the world's total, that is $30 trillion. Step into this parallel universe, one where the global 1%, super rich politicians, dictators, rock stars, sports stars, billionaire business tycoons, or even people convicted of crimes stash their wealth. It's always secret, discreet, private, always bespoke, but with a long paper trail.
New revelations on how the rich and the powerful hide cash are rocking countries around the world. The so-called Panama Papers contain allegations of money laundering and tax evasion.
Well, they are known as the Paradise Papers, and they reveal the tax affairs of rich and powerful people around the world.
But they are now periodically getting exposed for all of us to see and sift through. The real assets, the real income, and the real beneficiaries behind incredibly complex structures made by some of the best lawyers and accountants that money can buy, who work through a global network of trusts and shell companies from the tax havens around the world. Luxembourg, Cayman Islands, Mauritius to Monaco, Panama to Bermuda.
Aruba, Jamaica, ooh, I wanna take you. Bermuda, Bahama, come on, pretty mama. Key Largo, Montego, baby, why don't we go? Jamaica, off the Florida Keys.
In this podcast, we want to demystify all you ever wanted to know about investing money in the so-called tax havens. If your favorite cricketer can invest money in the British Virgin Islands, can you do so too? If a top business honcho can create a trust for his daughter and wife, where does that leave you? Why invest money abroad in the first place? And the question that's on everybody's mind, what's illegal and what's not? From the Economic Times, I'm Anjali Venugopalan and you're listening to the Morning Brief. Coming up in this explainer, all that you wanted to know about trusts and tax havens but were afraid to ask.
After Panama Papers in 2016, now has come the turn of Pandora Papers, being billed as quote-unquote the most expansive expose of financial secrecy.
First there were the Swiss leaks, then there was Panama, then came the Paradise Papers, and this week it was Pandora's turn to open the box. A series of revelations about the financial investments made in offshore accounts.
Some high-profile names involved include Jordan's King Abdullah, former UK Prime Minister Tony Blair, Vladimir Putin, Elton John even on the list.
And the alleged mistress of Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia.
In this latest round, those named are closer home cricketer Sachin Tendulkar, lobbyist Neera Radia, businessman Anil Ambani are some of those who have been alleged to have accounts abroad. The papers were released by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. Several named in the Pandora Papers have rebutted the allegations of illegality, saying that these are legitimate investments. My senior colleague Sugata Ghosh has been tracking this phenomenon for years, only to see them evolve over the decades as the flight of capital became a truly global malaise. According to data released by the Swiss Central Bank, some $2.7 billion worth of Indians' funds are in that picturesque country alone, known for most of us for its cheese, chocolates, and watches. It can be said that this country is among the earliest tax havens in the world.
So while tax havens conjure images of African dictators, corrupt politicians, and drug lords, and for very good reason. But what we tend to forget is that for a very long time, right since the 50s and 60s, many business families have been spending a lot of time to figure out ways to escape income tax. Because that was a time when the marginal tax rate was more than 97%. In 1974, it was cut to 75%. And then in the mid-80s, VP Singh brought it down to 50%. So for decades, many rich Indians have been secretly parking money in different ways. Under-invoicing of exports, over-invoicing of imports, or just handing over cash to a Hawala agent. Now all this money found its way to Switzerland, to Swiss banks, and other places. Swiss banks were the ones giving numbered accounts, that is, the bank's register didn't record the customer's name but identified the person with a number. Now there were many other places, for instance, Jersey. Now I recall this once an elderly gentleman who was a protector of many trusts told me that one of the reasons he preferred Jersey was because when you flew down from London to Jersey, your passport was never stamped at the Jersey airport, as it was a dependency of UK. So they had that political and diplomatic relations. So there were no records that you had been to Jersey. So there was Dubai, there was Liechtenstein, which lies between Germany and Austria. Now, how many of us ever knew of Liechtenstein before 2008 when the confidential information was leaked from Liechtenstein Bank? In fact, an old respected business family from the south, which was named in the list, have been holding assets in Liechtenstein since late 60s or early 70s. So besides evading tax, all this money was used for different purposes. If you had to pay bribes to politicians, meet expenses during your overseas stay or tours, or most importantly, to ring-fence funds in trusts, foundations, and other structures which are bankruptcy remote. And over the years, this mechanism to dodge tax had been perfected. And this big, well-oiled machine faced the big threat during the meltdown of 2008 when governments ran out of money. That was when the stashed wealth in tax havens came under serious scrutiny.
Actually, 2008 was an important year for the fight against black money. I spoke to Bijal Ajinkya, partner at Khaitan and Co, who told me about how, even as the entire world was going through a financial crisis, it was in 2008 that a French systems engineer and whistleblower named Harvey Falciani passed on data that he obtained from HSBC servers in Switzerland to the French government. And while it wasn't reported in the media then, the French government had quietly started sharing this information with other governments and had begun prosecuting offenders. It was only in 2015 that this data was published in the media, and it is now known as the Swiss leaks.
It was really in response to these leaks that essentially governments around the world really started looking at their tax laws and tried to enter into tax information exchange agreements with various countries, whereby they would get an exchange of information on any information which is requested by the Indian government. Different tax treaties have different dates, which could be having a difference as to whether for civil investigation you go on from 2011, and maybe in certain cases for criminal tax matters you can even ask for retroactive data. And to that extent, any information which is required by the Indian taxman to essentially administer its tax collection, or for that matter to come up with a tax assessment or prosecute a situation in a tax matter, can essentially be asked for from the foreign government.
The Swiss leaks in 2015 was just one of the reasons for this tightening of laws. In 2016, we had the Panama Papers. In 2017, it was the Paradise Papers. And now it's the Pandora Papers. Indian laws have gotten significantly harsher since then, both because of local political reasons as well as leaks such as these.
Well, the global attack on tax havens, when all these dramatic developments were happening in Europe, everything coincided with a very strong political statement in India to go after black money. Shed off this image of Sood Boot Ka Sarkar, the passage of the Black Money Act, and then unleashing demonetization in 2016.
आप मानते हैं कि हमारे देश में काला धन है? ऐसे नहीं, जोर से बोलो। आप मानते हैं कि विदेशी बैंकों में हिंदुस्तान का काला धन है? आप मानते हैं कि देश के कुछ चोर लुटेरों ने विदेशी बैंकों में हमारा पैसा जमा किया है? आप मानते हैं कि वो रुपये वापस आने चाहिए?
अरे एक बार ये जो चोर लुटेरों के पैसे विदेशी बैंकों में जमा है ना, उतने भी हम रुपये ले आए ना, तो भी हिंदुस्तान के एक एक गरीब आदमी को मुफ्त में 15-20 लाख रुपए यूं ही मिल जाए.
So the Black Money Act is a very harsh law. You could be asked to pay 120% of the amount. You can face prosecution, even jail time. And what makes it a potent tool is the power that tax officials have to go back in time. Earlier, they could go back 16 years under the Income Tax Act. But under Black Money Act, they can dig up 30 or 40-year-old financial secrets. For instance, if the tax department comes to know today about a Swiss account you had opened in 1971, that's 50 years ago, the money in that account would be deemed to have been earned today, and it will be taxed. So that is unsettling for many people. Besides, you have the PMLA, you have Benami, so you have a combination of very harsh laws which have made tax dodging far more difficult than what it was in the past. Even banks in Dubai, they ask a lot of questions. Singapore, they ask a lot of questions. You can't do what you could have done before. And you just can't open an account in some Central American republic or in places like Nigeria and other things. They may not ask questions, but then they can just walk away with money. The reason why Swiss banks survived was that because of the trust. Besides the secrecy, which was part of the covenant, it was the trust and the legacy of the 400-year legacy that your secret lies with us. So that's why most people dealt with Switzerland.
And maybe if I could just add to what Sugata mentioned, important to note that given the leaks and the introduction of the FATCA by the US, other countries have entered into what we call the CRS or the Common Reporting Standards, wherein offshore accounts essentially would be under an automatic exchange of information. The data would be exchanged with the Indian government and vice versa.
The FATCA or FATCA that Bijal mentioned refers to the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, a bilateral deal struck between the United States and India in 2015, which helps both countries track the assets of its nationals. Despite such harsh laws and tax treaties with other countries, the success rate for Indian tax authorities when it comes to prosecuting economic offenders has been really low.
All this tax planning happens with the help of some of the finest brains, some of the finest minds in finance, right? They set up trusts. There are multiple layers. For instance, you can set up a trust in Jersey. You can have offshore companies spread across different Cayman and other islands. Then you can have the bank accounts in other banks. So it requires the cooperation of multiple jurisdictions. Even if you have those, you have to prove that a particular person who is a beneficiary of a trust has actually gained from the trust. So today, you, Anjali, could be a beneficiary of a particular trust in, say, Cayman Islands or in British Virgin Islands. Now, but if you have not received any money from the trust, in that case, you can say that, look, I have not gained from the trust. Somebody has put my name. My uncle or my great grandmother has put my name here. But I have not earned anything, so I can't be taxed. Now, this is one of the reasons why some of the court rulings have gone in favor of the assessors. And the other reason is that often you hit a wall. It's very difficult to prove that you really had a malafide intention behind all these structures. And these were not just legitimate deals. They were actually ways to siphon out money.
The level of evidence which is really required to convict a person from a criminal perspective is extremely high, and unless the evidence is really creditworthy enough, the courts will always, I would say, be a little gentle as to whether or not to really impose that particular conviction. There have been a number of cases like wherein, as Sugata mentioned, wherein an Indian resident may merely be a beneficiary to an offshore structure and may not have really created that structure in itself. And unless, of course, that person has really received some income from that offshore structure and has not really disclosed such a receipt, only in those situations would there really be a civil liability followed with a criminal prosecution. So, of course, though there are a number of cases which are pending at this point in time, deciding on such cases from a criminal standpoint does really take that time.
Here's another factor that comes into the picture. Indian tax authorities inked a deal with Switzerland to share information about Indian Swiss bank accounts starting from 2010. But many believe that it was too late by then to actually catch the offenders.
So there is a widely shared perception that many people actually move the money out of Switzerland to places like Dubai and Singapore before the treaty was signed. Now, the negotiations of the treaty were going on for 2, 3, 4 years. So they had enough time to plan and move the money out. So one of the senior chartered accountants had told me that what they used to do is they used to form a company in the Dubai Free Trade Zone. And that company was formed by setting up through the LRS route, that is the liberalized remittance route, what Bijal was saying. And you transfer the money in Dubai. And then later, subsequently, you bring that money as dividend or through some other sources in income, as income in India, and pay tax on that money and legitimize it. Now, the thing is that since the treaty was not signed, there weren't too many questions that were asked by Singapore banks or by the Dubai banks, because it was just a transfer from a bank to bank. And once you close the account, just clean your records in Switzerland before the treaty is signed, then the Swiss banks are also under no obligation to rake up the past and share information on accounts which are no longer with them and which have been closed long ago. So there is this chatter we always hear that a lot of big fish, they escaped and they were smart enough to move the money and plan and ring fence it in safe locations.
But let's assume you're not an economic offender and you just want to invest money abroad. In that case, what are your options? According to the liberalized remittance scheme, Indians can invest up to $250,000 abroad every year. That is, if you are a resident of India.
So there are a number of ways in which Indians can actually set up remit funds outside of India and set up official businesses as well as investments outside of India. Of course, care needs to be taken of the tax regulations, and to that extent, whether they're controlled from India, etc., is a different ball game which does need to be looked at. Also, returning Indians, which are Indians who have lived outside of India for a number of years, having earned offshore funds while being a non resident, can actually create structures prior to their relocation to India. And this is often done vis a vis succession planning as well as asset protection needs for their global Indian families.
You can invest in different capital assets like properties, stocks, land. But the thing is that you have to disclose them in the FS schedule, that is in the income tax returns. For instance, you are within your rights to buy an apartment in Dubai. But the rent you earn from that apartment, you have to pay tax on that rent to the Indian government. The same if you buy stocks listed on the NYSE, and the dividend you earn from that, you have to pay tax on that.
This is where taxpayers need to be careful about disclosing all these investments to the taxman.
Often I have seen that the understanding of the Indian taxpayer is skewed here, and they are not aware that they need to actually offer it to Indian taxes. But yes, if the investments are made in an individual name, it is important for it to be reported in the Indian tax return and subsequently a tax to be paid on the same.
One of the terms that came up several times in the Pandora Papers were trusts. In fact, most of the data came from within these trusts, such as the Asia City Trust in Singapore or the Trident Trust in the British Virgin Islands. These trusts acted as agents for the persons named in the leaks and facilitated investments for them, some of them allegedly illegal.
We've often seen, I would say, trust referred to in the negative light. But to be very honest, trust is a very old, tried and tested, and very traditional form of succession planning and asset distribution between family members, and a very commonly used structure for families. A trust is a concept which exists in common law countries, wherein you have a creator of a trust who essentially reposes confidence on a trustee who's like a fiduciary to such a trust. And such a person essentially needs to take care of the trust property for the benefit of the beneficiaries themselves. Unfortunately, with any leak, all the persons or data who's really being compromised are always seen in the same negative lens. And I think it is important to note that, as I mentioned, earlier, there are a number of legitimate structures permitted. And to that extent, Indian residents can have investments and structures outside of India. And to that extent, to really consider all of them in the same slate as tainted would really be unfair.
Okay.
I entirely agree. For instance, one particular case, there is a case about someone who is banned in the Indian capital market, banned from trading, a person who is banned from trading in the Indian capital market for a year was found to be a protector of a trust abroad. Now, technically, it's not a violation of any law. Even if I'm banned from trading here, I can be a protector or a settler or a trustee abroad. So why is that a scandalous piece of information?
And while there are plenty of legal ways to invest your money abroad, opening a secret account like India's businessmen did in the 60s and 70s isn't all that easy anymore.
No, I don't think it will be easy at all. I don't think so. Because, first of all, you won't take the risk. And I don't think even tax advisors, lawyers would be forthcoming in advising you to go for very aggressive structures. Because we have seen cases where the government has even gone after lawyers for helping people to what they feel was laundering money. So that was unheard of before. So even lawyers, some of the top-notch lawyers, they can face action. So I don't think anybody would be giving you that kind of advice. So it will be very difficult to do all those kind of structures. People are still doing it. I was told that through different kind of offshore companies and through multiple webs and other things. But you never know, because even if a jurisdiction, even if you particularly, suppose you store your money or set up structures in a particularly unfriendly jurisdiction, unfriendly in the sense that jurisdiction which does not cooperate with the Indian government. But you never know, some activist hacker or some whistleblower can just leak the information one day. And then it's can be very difficult for you after that. Just imagine the kind of, besides the embarrassment, the mental pressure, the tax notices, the surveys, the raids, the expensive affair of hiring lawyers abroad and everything, it's not something you want to live with.
As laws get tougher, the ways to get around it have become even more complex and difficult. And the Pandora Papers have showed us that the secrets of the world's rich may not remain all that secret anymore. I'm Anjali Venugopalan, and you've been listening to The Morning Brief. This episode was edited and coordinated by Shashwat Mohanty and produced by Soundarya Jayachandran. Sound editing by Varun Kapahi. The Morning Brief airs every Tuesday, Thursday and Friday. Write to us at themorningbreef@timesgroup.com. And if you like this episode, please share it on your social media handles. We'd appreciate it. Thank you for listening and have a great day. All clips used in this episode belong to their respective owners. Credits have been mentioned in the description.